Good afternoon. I'm Father David. Thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time as we are honoring the memorial of Saints Basil the Great and Gregory Nazianzen. So these were bishops and doctors of the church, and Saint Basil the Great was actually the patron saint of hospital administrators, monks, and reformers. And Saint Gregory Nazianzen was the patron saint of harvests and poets. And both of these saints were bishops and doctors of the church who argued for the full divinity of Christ. So both saints were also from Cappadocia, and both saints followed the monastic way of life. In fact, while Saint Benedict is considered the father of Western monasticism, Saint Basil the Great is considered the father of Eastern monasticism. And what set both of these monks apart is that they beautifully balanced that monastic contemplative life with the active life of a pastor. And that's something that I could relate to, being in the Order of St. Luke and also being in a pastoral position, engaging their communities with their faith and compassion and kind of sharing contemplative practices as they went along the way. And as I thought about St. Basil the Great being a doctor of the church and the saint of hospital administrators, my mind kind of drifted to the scene of my wife having our third child by way of cesarean. And the doctor had invited me into the operating room to be there for the procedure and the birth. But before I could go into the room, the nurses came to help me get prepared. And the most important thing I needed to do to prepare for the entrance of our child actually into the world was to wash myself clean of all the contaminants, anything that might bring any kind of infection. So there I stood at the operating washroom sink, just washing and washing and washing and washing. Every time I thought I was done, the nurse would say, "No, keep washing. Go all the way up to your elbows. Don't forget to get this spot and that spot. Use the brush on your fingernails." I mean, it went on, right? And my hands and forearms, I don't think have ever been that clean in my whole life, and they probably won't ever be that clean again in the future. But this is what popped into my head when I was considering the gospel reading today from John chapter 1. And, I've already kind of covered the first portion of this text in my homily for the third week of Advent. If you want to see that, you can kind of find that in the videos here. But it's where the scribes and the Pharisees are desperately trying to define who John the Baptist is, and they're trying to get him in some kind of box, right? And so today I want to focus on the exchange there in John 1, verse 24 through 27, where we read this. It says, "Some Pharisees were also sent. They asked him, 'Why then do you baptize if you are not the Messiah, or Elijah, or the prophet?' John answered them, 'I baptize with water, but there is one among you whom you do not recognize, the one who is coming after me, whose sandal strap I am not worthy to untie.'" So we see that John's purpose in this baptism was really to cleanse people in order to prepare them for Christ. That's what baptism was in that day. The baptism which would come later, the one instituted by the church, would kind of have a similar purpose in a way. I mean, with the added grace of being a unification with Christ and his death and resurrection. We have in confirmation the sealing of the Holy Spirit, the giving of spiritual gifts. But for John and for much of the first century world, baptism was a type of ritual purification where the unclean within and without was symbolically and literally washed away. And this cleansing would then be the preparatory act for those awaiting the coming of Christ. In fact, the Talmud even has a special type of washing that requires 40 units of water. I found that to be very interesting recently in my own studies. And like I said, though, this cleansing that John the Baptist was engaging in was kind of a preparatory act for those who were awaiting the coming of Christ. And as I thought about this, I thought, what a wonderfully powerful and practical exercise, right? When I was in my religions class in the seminary, we had to go to all these different temples and Eastern churches and all this kind of stuff. And they still have a practice of when you go into the temple space of ritually washing and cleansing yourself as you enter the temple before you go to prayer and to communion with God. So you would go in and literally they had a washroom in some of these Eastern churches and stuff like that where you would wash your feet, you would wash your hands, your face, your elbows. Some of the mosques even had that kind of stuff, and all this was before you could go into the sanctuary. And that was one of my favorite classes, world religions actually. And this is basically what John was doing in the Jordan River. He was helping people prepare in a symbolic way. So I thought, how could we benefit from something like this? I mean, we certainly don't rebaptize people after they're baptized, but what about the idea of ritual cleansing, with water, the insides, the outsides, through the use of running water? This is something that continues on in certain temples today in certain parts of the world. As you go in, just to go into the holy space, you wash yourself, right? And so I thought maybe a good practical exercise, right, for us to do might be along the lines of something similar, right? So the next time you wash your hands or maybe take a shower, I want you to just visualize as the water is washing over you or over your hands the next time you wash, like maybe something that's causing you pain, something that's hurting you, maybe some anger you have, something from your past. I don't know, whatever it is in that moment that makes you kind of feel unclean or unworthy for whatever reason, just wash it off. Let the water, as it's going over your body and over your hands, just pull that out and let it go right down the drain. I mean, just kind of use that as a practical exercise and think about ritual washing. I know that as we come into our sanctuary space, we're not going to go probably to the restroom and wash away things like that. But this used to actually be a practice in the church. So that's my application today. It's kind of like a practical exercise to go home and maybe just think about something that's causing you pain or grief, and just as you wash your hands, just let that flow away and let the grace of God do a transforming work through that cleansing of water. Well, thank you for joining me today as we've looked at the memorial of Saint Basil the Great and Gregory Nazianzen.